Welcome everybody who have joined already. We're just going to take a couple of more minutes to let other participants come in. So please bear with us. Okay, I got the signal to start. So yeah, people might just join along the lines, but those who are with us already, I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is jointly hosted by Elevate and CMCC. And as the title suggests already, we're going to delve a bit into the investment conditions that are currently represented in IAM modeling or energy economic modeling, and see a bit how their role or what changes to these assumptions might impact, how changes to these assumptions might impact climate mitigation pathways. For your information, this webinar will be recorded, so if you have any issues against that, let us know in the chat now. Yeah, as I said, this webinar is co-hosted by Elevate. Elevate is a EU Horizon project that started in 2022 and aims to further improve scientific insights to support the NDC, but also the net zero target setting processes globally, and of course in line with the Paris Agreement, and ideally well below a 1.5 degree scenario. Thereby, we also put a lot of focus and a lot of effort into strengthening the research policy interface and external stakeholder engagement. So I think this webinar is also meant to support us in showcasing what other research or what research insights we develop throughout the project. It's also being supported, I think, by Prisma project. This is a project that works more on the model development side. So it's really a joint effort of various project teams of the global IAM modeling community. And our speaker today is Matteo Calcaterra. He's a PhD student at the Politecnico di Milano and a visiting student in CMCC, or the European Institute on Economics and the Environment in Milan. He focuses on economic modeling of the climate transition, and especially here looking from a public finance perspective. So in that sense, he's been also co-authoring other papers on climate impact on income distributions, but also loss and damage financing needs. And in this session, he will present this recent paper that's about to be published. So you will all be notified, presumably when the publishing is out, with the title of Reducing Cost of Capital to Finance the Energy Transition in Developing Countries, a Multimodal Analysis. This research investigates, as I mentioned, the broader implications of diverse investment conditions. So specifically here, differing cost of capital assumptions across regions and IAMs, and seeing what the impact is on climate transition pathways and emission gaps. So technically, or generally, we have in IAMs usually a uniform cost of capital assumption that's being implemented and thereby create equal investment conditions, which of course don't represent the actual real world investment conditions we see. So by varying the cost per region and technology, he tries to basically show a more realistic representation of investment into energy technologies specifically. Yeah, I think we're going to hear first from Matteo now for the next 40 minutes, presenting his main results, the intention of the research, and further implications. I'll ask you to ideally note down your questions, because we have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to discuss and to engage. You are, of course, allowed to unmute yourself and raise your questions. If you don't want to do that, then please use the chat function in between. And yeah, with that, I'm going to hand over to Matteo, and we hear from him.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this webinar. And let's start with some context. According to the latest IPCC report, finance is a critical enabler to accelerate climate action. However, unequal access to finance can be a barrier to climate investment. So what does it mean? We look at this perspective in this paper and from the point of view of the cost of capital of energy generation technologies. As any TED Talk tells you, start with an example that is relatable to the audience. I don't think anyone in here reads the quarterly journals of corporate finance on Sunday morning, so I try to make this as relatable as possible, but it's not. But whatever. Let's say there is a person, number one, that wants to buy a brand new house, which costs $3 signs. And there is person number two, which wants to buy a brand new house in the same condo, exactly the same house, with the same price. What do? Most likely, they go to a bank to ask for the money. The bank will do their background checks, they see the credit score, whatever, and then we'll come up with basically a mortgage rate. So whatever interest they have to pay to get the $3 signs of money. And person number one is going to get a certain one, and person number two is going to get a different one because they have different underlying characteristics. And so this is kind of an instance of cost of capital. This is how the most relatable we can get to it. But what is really this cost of capital? This NYU professor, which is very important in the field, says, if you asked a dozen investors, managers, or analysts this question, you're likely to get a dozen different answers. They are all right. This is just to say that if it's not clear, it's not my fault. It's the analysts and there's those investors that they cannot agree on one. But what is the cost of capital? It depends who you're asking, basically, as we said. For investors in companies, so for someone who has the money and they want to invest it in companies, it's kind of an opportunity cost. So the rate of return that investors expect to make in other investments of equivalent risk. So if I invest in you, I cannot invest in somebody else. And so I have an opportunity cost because I have to give up another investment to invest in you. So this is one form that the cost of capital takes. But for companies themselves, so after the investors have invested in these companies and they require this cost of capital back, they require the return. So it's basically the cost of financing. So companies can get funding at this rate. So they have to give back the return, right? And from within the company afterwards, when the company has to decide where to invest, it can act like a harder rate. So it's like the minimum rate of return required on a project, on an investment that you can use to decide whether to invest in this or in that project, in that firm or whatever. So we kind of have a broad idea, very broad, of what this is, but how is it used? It is used, as you can expect, in many ways. What we care about, among the others, is that it is a financing cost. So basically, it makes an investment more costly than its bare capital cost, like the house, right? At the beginning, the house had the $3 signs, but you have to pay more because you have to finance it. Because you give back money later in time, basically. And then it also acts as a discount rate, which basically allows to compare cash flows at different points in time. And we're going to see later this implies. But these are the two main points that we care about here about cost of capital. How is it calculated? So the main way it is calculated is via the so-called WACC, which is the weighted average cost of capital. Why weighted average? Because we have two main sources of financing, the debt and equity, where like debt is just like a loan or basically, or emitting a bond or whatever. And cost of equity is like direct ownership in a company by shareholders. And so you have these two sources of financing, and you weight them basically by their share of the funding. So it's just a super simple weighted average. You sum the two, and you get the cost of capital by the weighted average cost of capital by definition. And so how are the cost of debt and cost of equity determined? So for the cost of debt, you start from the global risk-free rate, which is basically a rate underneath which you cannot invest, basically, like the lowest possible risk rate. And it's usually a bond, a 10-year long bond by the US government. It's like 1.8% or something like this. And on top of this, you add components based on the different risk layers that you have. So you can add a country default spread. So the fact that you are investing in a country that is less safe than this bond. An infrastructure premium. So for example, you are investing in private infrastructure projects rather than like other sort of debts that are safer. And this is kind of like, I think, 2% or something. And then we have a technology premium, which is really like if you invest in a specific technology, the specific technology will have a proper risk premium, which is specific. So we have that. And the cost of equity, similar, you start from the global risk-free rate, and you add up with an equity risk premium because equity is riskier and more volatile than debt. So you have, just because it's equity, you have a premium. You have a country equity premium, similar to the default spreads, kind of like the concept. And then you have also here a technology premium. So we have all these elements. Many of these are quite straightforward to get from other sources. And what we do, especially my co-authors in this paper, what they did was to estimate the cost of capital for energy generation technologies using this methodology. In particular, the main point they estimated was the technology premium and the weight of debt and equity. And so the technology premium is estimated like this. Basically, there are two main approaches taken from the literature. So for fossil fuel-based generation and hydro, so like a gas plant or a coal plant or like a big hydropower, like these are big things. So they are financed by energy utilities, which are the big companies that every country has. And so basically, these are more likely public companies. They have a balance sheet that is accessible. And so by using the data from this balance sheet, you can recover the cost that their cost of capital. So how much it is costly for them to finance themselves and stuff. Instead, for non-hydro renewables like solar and wind, these are more likely smaller projects. And so basically their cost of capital is mostly driven by country and by the country in which they are and by the specific technology that they are. If it's a solar, what type of solar, if it's onshore, offshore wind, whatever, you know it. And this is exactly done to project finance. So each project is financed independently and will have its own cost of capital. We kind of abstract from the project level and use just the main the country and technology level. So like basically we are kind of assuming that there is no differentiation between a project within country. They are kind of all the same, but because we don't go more granular than this. And so basically we deconstruct the cost of capital into different components and use it to impute the cost of capital for countries for which we don't have the data. So what we obtain is a quite large database across different technologies and across different countries of empirically estimated cost of capital for energy technologies. Here it's a little bit unclear to see because first I would like you to focus on the legend, because this is basically a regional aggregation that is going to follow us with the presentation, and so it's better to make it clear now. We have kind of like a traffic light kind of symbol, a kind of palette in which we have green, yellow, and red. And for the green countries, they have the lowest cost of capital. So like it's very easy for them to access finance. Yellow countries also have a quite low cost of capital, but not as low. And red, instead, red like countries and regions will have the highest kind of cost of capital. And they are Africa, Latin America, Middle East, non-EU, Eastern European, and transition countries, and they will be kind of the focus of the analysis. So now we can look at it a little bit better. And what we see here is that every map shows basically the cost of capital of one generation technology for all the countries that are in our sample. And what is the takeaway here? By broadly looking at it, you can see that there are many more darker, that the countries that have the red borders are darker, so they have a higher cost of capital. Watch out, because the scaling is non-linear, but whatever. And also in the top left corner, you can see kind of it's the naive average of all these values. So it's kind of just to give a simple number to think at when we're thinking, instead of across countries, we're thinking across technologies. So you can see that, for example, gas plants can be financed in a cheaper way than, for example, offshore wind that are right below. Okay, and so this is to say basically that more traditional ways to generate electricity are also cheaper from the finance point of view, because the finance sector is more used at financing this. So it sees less risk, and it's more able at least to assess the risk of these projects. So it's actually cheaper to invest in them, right? And instead, for renewables, for which like the capital cost is going down very quickly, the financing cost is still a little bit catching up with it, and it's still higher. It's still considered more risky. To continue the context that I started in the first place, we saw that finance is a critical enabler to accelerate the climate action, but unequal access to finance is a barrier to climate investment. And in particular, what we just saw is that this is true for developing countries and renewable energy sources in particular, right? And basically, this is because the whole point why we're here, for the high cost of capital. But you're gonna ask me, what are the consequences of a high cost of capital? And so basically, I take a step back and I tell you, let's suppose we have two investments. Like, this is super basic, okay? So we have an investment that is more front-loaded and another one that is less so. What does it mean? Basically, as you can see in the first column, we have a big expenditure basically in the first period to finance our thing. And then we have three little negative columns, which are basically meaning some small operating cost. Instead, in the less front-loaded investment, we have a lower column, like a less negative column in the first period, but then more negative columns in the second, third, and fourth period. And then the payoff, so the positive bar, the benefit, it's the same for both projects, right? So what happens is that basically these projects, the cost and benefits, the difference is the same. It's both 160. Like, if you just sum up the costs and benefits of the projects, you get 160. So they are kind of like, from the point of view of aggregated money that moves around, it's the same, right? What changes is the timing. In one point, you have an investment for which the cost is more really in the first period, and so that is a front-loaded investment, and then another one in which the cost is more kind of diluted over time. And what it means is that, if you remember earlier, I said the cost of capital used for discounting, right? So it's when we assume that money today is more valuable than money in the future, what we're basically saying is that we are gonna penalize cash flows that happen further in the future in favor of cash flows that happen today. So if we basically calculate the net present value, which is just summing all the cash flows, but accounting for this fact that some cash flows happen later in the future, what we get with a 5% discount rate is that the front-loaded investment will be not the same, 160, but lower in terms of value than the less front-loaded investment, and the distance is going to increase even more if we increase the interest rate. So you see how if an investment is front-loaded, the cost of capital is much more material than if an investment is less front-loaded. And this happens to be the case for renewable energy, because renewable energy has higher installation costs at the beginning, but then it has basically, I mean, the sun shines for free, the blows for free. So basically the operating costs are much lower compared to a fossil generation plant for which you have to buy. If you have a gas plant, you have to buy the gas. So that's a cost. Instead, you don't buy the sun or the wind. And so this is kind of how renewables are front-loaded and traditional electricity generation methods are not. And indeed, there is evidence in the literature that there are large consequences for high cost of capital for renewable energy. And you can see here, like basically in every couple of columns, the left column has a low financing cost and the right one a high one. And you see how for the ones dubbed renewable, like for the ones in the renewable section, the difference between the two columns is staggeringly high compared to the ones that are fossil fuel based. So this is a big problem, especially now that we see that financing costs actually are going up in the world and can be a problem for transition. So to get back again to the context, because it helps to repeat stuff, finance is a critical enabler, but unequal access to finance is a barrier. And this is true for developing countries and renewables because of high cost of capital. What does this mean? We understood that this means that it's more difficult to mobilize, especially private funding for the transition, if there is high cost of capital, and also that this is more impactful for renewables because they are more capital intensive, just described. And in particular, what we are interested in this work is that this is an issue for energy justice. And so why? Why is this an issue for energy justice? Energy justice can be defined as the global energy system that fairly disseminates both the benefits and the costs of energy services, and one that contributes to more representative and impartial energy decision-making. And also, it's very interesting that energy systems are a foundation of social and economic development and affect delivery of outcomes across all SDGs. Basically, this paper, what they do is kind of like they estimate the kind of collinearity, the enabling potential of the energy system as an SDG, because it's an SDG in itself, with respect to the other SDGs. And you see that this SDG is very like linked to all the other SDGs, except for a couple, but most of them, they kind of go together. So this is quite something that is quite fundamental in terms of development and quite important in terms of justice of the transition, if you want a just transition and so. And also, like, exactly, enhancing access to clean and modern energy should rightly be seen as an integral part of the efforts to incorporate justice consideration in the ongoing clean energy transition, and therefore, multi and interdisciplinary research employing varied research design conducted at different scales is needed. And this is precisely what we do. We kind of like fit in this kind of general call for evidence. And exactly, now you're gonna be asking me, but okay, you explain us all the context, what do you do? What we do is that we have 5 coupled energy climate economy models, which are GCAM, IMAGE, TIAM, and WICH. These are models that regularly inform the IPCC assessments. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. And basically, they have an important role in informing policy design and mitigation policies, both at the national and at the international level. Here, we focus more on the international level, right? And before this effort, they had a uniform or implicit cost of capital. Uniform meaning like all countries, all technologies had the same cost of capital because there was no data. However, we have data. We estimated it. So, in particular, we have data differentiated across 3 dimensions, right? So geography, across technology, and also we can project it across time through the use of basically learning rates, right? We said earlier that some technologies both have a higher cost of capital because the finance sector is not as good as financing them because it's not less as used to. So in this paper, they estimated basically that there is a 5% reduction in the cost of capital for every doubling of domestic capacity. So basically that the finance sector becomes better at evaluating the risks, and so the costs go down. And so using this, we can project the cost of capital through time. And so we take this and put it in the models. And this is basically our modeling improvement that allows us to answer our research question. So where we do it, this in two worlds, one NDC world and one that is a 1.5D world. What are they? In an NDC world, countries fulfill their nationally determined contributions, which are basically the pledges that they've made of decarbonization. They fulfill them by 2030. After them, they have no pledges that are law. So basically, we are like following the literature, we apply an equivalent level of climate effort going forward. And basically what we get is a temperature of 2.6 degrees of warming by the end of the century, right? By 2100. So this is basically a world in which there is no further climate commitment rather than what we have currently. Instead, in 1.5D world, we look at the other way, the other possible scenario, let's say. So the temperature is kept under 1.5 degrees of warming. This is done through an implementation of a carbon budget after achieving the NDCs. And basically, the signal that the model need to follow a carbon budget is a cost minimizing uniform global carbon tax, but it's not particularly important here. And so finally, why do we do this? We do this so we can ask what happens to the justice of the energy transition if international access to financing becomes equal. And more specifically, we basically look at a scenario in which wherever higher, the cost of capital converges by mid-century to the level of that is today in the EU, USA. So we kind of, I'm gonna show later better. And we call this a cost of capital convergence scenario. And it's always like gonna come up later in the results. And we compare this to a scenario in which this does not happen, basically. The cost of capital just follows our original projection that I described earlier. And we call this the cost of capital reference scenario, right? With big fantasy. And you can see here, this is a little bit what happens. With the clearer color on top, you can just see the projection. So basically, in high cost of capital countries, which is the column on the right, you start from higher levels by definition, and then you kind of go down following more capacities installed, the more you go down with these costs. Okay. And then what we see, what we're interested in is our like kind of policy scenario, which is basically this reduction. We assume this exogenously, we assume this happens. And then, so basically you see in high cost of capital countries, the level goes to basically down to the same that is in the other regions, right? We assume this reduction. And then for the rest of the paper and for all the results, kind of we check what happens between these two scenarios. We check the difference between the two. And these are basically our results. We build on a rich literature on the importance of modeling differentiated cost of capital and on the benefits of its exogenous reduction on the cost of transition and on climate. There are a lot of people that wrote great papers about this before. And now our results. So first thing, we see more renewable energy generation when these convergences happen. And you can see it here, especially like in the high cost of capital column, you see a lot of green, a lot of renewables, and in NDC also a bit of nuclear and some reduction in fossil generation. You can also see there is some, like since we use 5 models, we can basically have a glimpse of the uncertainty of these results. On the right there, show you the levels that are reached by each model in 2100. so to see a little bit what the spread is of the results. And one thing that we can notice immediately by looking at this is that this is quite substantial numbers in terms of magnitude, especially for the NDC scenario, right? In which basically we are assuming, except for this policy, not other commitments. And so basically we can think like, what is the effect of this? How closer to the 1.5 target does this bring us, right? And this is what we do in the right panel, basically. You can see like the darker bars are basically what is done in an NDC scenario, but with the convergence policy. And in the lighter bars that are kind of, let's say, behind, the number is what happens in a run that stays under 1.5 degrees of warming without the policy. So just like the base run, okay? And so what we see is that there is quite some disagreement across models, especially, I mean, different models have different final levels of energy that they go to, and in general, the numbers are very varied, but what we see is that there is always like a quite strong signal in favor of this policy as an enabling policy. In the median, it makes up 30% of the renewable electricity that you would need in a scenario that for basically decarbonization according to Paris Agreement, and the 10% of the fossil fuel reduction. So this is quite substantial. Secondly, electricity price is reduced. So we saw there is more electricity, but also this electricity is cheaper. And what we see here is that if you focus on the red line and ribbon, what we see is that this is consistently negative, and the median is about a reduction of 10%. This is a very aggregate median across the scenarios, regions, and models. And you can see kind of the breakout on the right side to see where different models and different scenarios are. Basically, we kind of see that there is not particular difference between the NDC and the 1.5 scenario. They're kind of similar, and also some models tend to be stronger than others, and they kind of keep it there. And so basically, we just saw there is a quantity effect. More or something, well, cost goes down. This is our scenario, right? Cost of capital goes down. This means that, as in any economic setting, quantities go up because it's less costly, but also price goes down. And we have both these effects, right? And it's interesting to see which one prevails, especially in the context of mitigation, right? Both are stuff that would kind of make mitigation more or less expensive or more happening or so. So basically what we see is that the quantity effect prevails in the NDC scenario. What does it mean? Basically, you can check, just focus maybe for now on the color, and you can see that in countries with red borders, the color is darker, meaning that there is a more extreme reduction of carbon intensity, which is the ratio basically of emissions to energy produced. So basically, this means that there is less pollution because of energy, let's say. The carbon intensity is lower. And so this kind of captures the quantity effects of mitigation. And on the other hand, the price effect prevails in the 1.5D scenario. And here we look at policy costs. Since in the 1.5D scenario, mitigation is kind of constrained, right? Like you have to stay under 1.5 degrees. This is already quite a stringent task for the model, quite a stringent request. We don't see too much on the quantities in terms of emissions, for example, because we are already at the boundary, but we see a lot on how much it costs to get there. So it costs much less. In general, this is like, I had to bundle up the colors, but in all these regions, there is a reduction in cost of getting there from 5 to 15%. So that's quite large, okay? And lastly, like everything that we saw so far kind of hints at energy justice implications, but we can look at them more explicitly. First of all, this shows the percentage difference in energy expenditure to GDP for different countries in different scenarios. And we can see that, for example, on the left for India, Africa, Latin America, there is a quite large reduction between basically 2.5 and 5% reduction between when this policy is enacted. So basically, let's to summarize this in one sentence is like with the convergence policy, you spend 5%, 3% less compared to energy to your GDP. Okay, so you just spend less money for energy. And this happens more in developing countries than in developed countries. And we can also check what is kind of an inequality index. So let's say as an inequality index, here we use the 80-20 ratio. So we kind of take it's 10 regions. Take the 2 poorest regions, take the 2 richest regions, and then compare the ratio between the 2 and see how this changes between the 2 scenarios and to see the inequality difference. And so there is a reduction in both scenarios of inequality in terms of, I always forget, renewable electricity generation. So basically, generation of renewable electricity is more equal, like it's more equally distributed across very poor and very rich countries, as much as like 5% in the median for NDC and about 2.5% in the 1.5 degrees scenario. And lastly, this is basically a renewable energy capacity Lorentz curve. What we care about is looking mostly at the 1.5D scenario. And what we are interested in is looking at whether the dotted line or the solid line is closer to the diagonal, to the straight diagonal line. Because the closer, the better. The closer, the less inequality there is. And we see that the solid line, which shows the convergence scenario, it is closer. And the difference between the columns are highlighted in colored yellow and red according to the region. But we see basically this entails, I think like a 1.5 or 2% reduction in the Gini index for renewable electricity capacity generation. So basically this means that also in this case, like considering instead not only the 2 richest and the 2 poorest regions, but considering kind of all of them, inequality in terms of renewable access decreases with this policy. So to recap, we explored the effects of a generic policy that creates equal access to energy finance by mid-century. This policy, which is generic, we don't particularly talk about it, is motivated by energy justice. So for dissemination of benefits and costs of energy services. Energy efficiency, because we need to build capacity where there is the highest potential from the energy point of view. And if finance goes in between, it's a barrier and we should get rid of it or like do something about it. And also about financial fairness, because fair finance should flow from developed to developing countries, right? And clearly, this is very ambitious. First of all, the cost of capital depends on multiple complex factors. So the quality of institutions, macroeconomic stability, financial sector maturity, and other stuff that goes in this macro area of fuzzy stuff. And this is not easily controlled by policymakers. It depends on a bunch of things, right? However, like we kind of highlight the possibility of exploiting energy sector specific policy lever. You don't have to fix the country risk premium, like the whole country, but maybe you can do something about the energy sector, maybe. For example, there is evidence that energy system support policies can lower the cost of renewables deployment by around 30%. and that risk-sensitive renewable energy policies can reduce the levelized cost of electricity, which is just a measure of lifetime cost of electricity, but it's not, doesn't matter too much, like the cost of electricity by 10 to 30%. Also auctions, using auctions in this, like when deciding to which projects to invest, can improve the financing. And this can be fostered by multilateral guarantee mechanisms, which can reduce the cost of capital by 6 to 7%, which is more than what we assume here. Like we kind of assume like a 4% decrease in the cost of capital. Instead, in this modeling exercise, they found even larger effects. Also, like a policy like this, strictly speaking, in our modeling setting, it has no cost, but it might have a cost. There are other numerical studies that basically look at this, and basically they find that a multilateral sovereign guarantee fund could be compatible with public budgets of developing countries and even impact the guarantor's account positively. But it's like a kind of a stretch possibility, but in their modeling setting, it happens. But nevertheless, there might be risk spillovers to the global north, right? You put a guarantee on somebody that is risky, and I mean, this is not fairy magic, but some risk also spills over to you. And we explored this in a robustness scenario, basically in which the magnitude and in which there is a kind of this spillover, and what we see is that the magnitude of the results is clearly reduced, but the rate direction is robust. Some sort of limitations of this study is that we don't focus explicitly on financing enabling infrastructure, which is like grid transmission, energy storage, and hydrogen, which are critical for the practicality of the energy transition. And all the models have different ways of taking into account the fact that renewable energy is variable and that it's not so easy to integrate it to the grid compared to other more traditional fossil fuel-based generation technologies. Each model kind of takes this into account in their own way, or they have different ways to take it. I mean, they do it in different ways, but what we care about here is more like the financing part. And to this extent, like the financing of these three components is kind of different than renewable energy projects, because renewable energy projects are now to the moment in which they're project finance and the private sector invests there, right? Like the large amount of capital comes from the private sector. Instead, for this, in the case of this enabling infrastructure, grid development is public, and the cost of financing is going to be linked to the sovereign rating, and there is no way around it. And also, hydrogen and storage, instead, they could be financed like this, but presently they are too early in the learning curve, in the growth curve, and so they need active public support. And so also for them, at least currently, the main barrier is whatever the public sector charges, which is not energy sector. And so, this is the conclusions, not other limitations. Basically, so we can conclude by saying that policies helping the cost of capital of the energy sector converge internationally can play a significant role in greening electricity generation, lowering the cost of mitigation, and improving equity. And in other words, this can give the triple dividend of increasing energy access, enhancing social and economic benefits, and advancing climate goals. Thank you, and I'm happy to receive any question.
Great. Thank you, Matteo. It was a really well outlined and well explained research from your side. Thanks a lot. Yeah, are there any questions? As I said, please raise your hands, or you can also type in the chat. I'm gonna see whether people have any questions to come up with. Otherwise, of course, I have one or two.
We have a question here in presence.
Oh yeah, then go ahead, please. I don't see the room.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Matteo, for the presentation. Very interesting. Maybe two questions. You already answered like the first one that I had. Like if you were to choose between helping financing renewable energy or grid investment, like maybe and the policy has a cost, which one will you choose?
What's the second option, sorry?
Investment in the grid or investing in renewable energy, where you can invest in the grid. But okay, that you already answered kind of that one. And the second one is maybe a comment or your point of view on exchange rates and currency rates for these types of measures. Because, for example, in developing countries, the easiest way to reduce the cost of capital for a project will be to create an auction that is paid in dollars by the public. But that's super expensive, and like developing countries are moving away from that solution because it got crazy and like it doesn't make any sense for the particular country itself. So maybe not a question, but a comment on that.
Oh yeah, for the first one, I didn't read so much about the grid financing, but I know it's a large barrier. Actually, currently in developing countries, is also a large barrier, and that's potentially even more difficult to act upon. Like this is already, like what I presented is already something very difficult to bring to life in practice. In practice, for grid development is even more, because as I was saying earlier, usually the financing for the grid is public. And for basically what happens for any public company in any country is that you're gonna have what is called a sovereign cap. So it doesn't matter how good your public company is, it's always gonna be capped by the rating of the sovereign. So if the sovereign, if maybe you have the best electricity utility ever, like it works super efficiently, it's basically kind of safe to invest in the utility if it was like a self-standing entity, but it's not. It's always dependent on a public sector that needs to pay for it eventually, and so or potentially if it goes bad, because that's maybe the point. Like if it goes bad, the public sector puts the money. So basically, you have this sovereign cap. And this means that basically it's impossible, or it's very difficult to act on this cost of capital unless you really put the capital yourself from other sources. So it's more difficult to do like the risking in this case, in my opinion. And this is mainly a barrier. Like I read some articles by saying that in the developing countries, it's very difficult to invest in grid developments, also because of this. And so honestly, this is, I mean, in the paper, I say this is avenues for future research. I just find it very difficult to think about solutions for this. And for the second comment, this is something that we thought about the basically the fact that the foreign exchange issue, and we kind of trusted this Orkad, Dasgupta, and Gersi 2021 paper. I don't remember if they have a foreign exchange in there, but they do a quite decent elaborated modeling effort to see if this would even be compatible with developing countries' public budgets, because we know that we are already kind of at a boundary in terms of how much external financing developing countries can get from outside, especially because of the different currency. Because basically it means that you have to create reserves in that currency to pay it off. So you need to export. Like it's a little bit it's difficult, and so for the purpose of this paper, we kind of trusted these guys, but I'm sure there is much more to say to this.
Is there anybody else? Do you have... Okay.
There's someone
so just
live?
yeah, can I ask a question or?
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Okay. So just for clarification, when you were talking about the quantity increases, is it only for renewable or in total the energy basically consumption increases?
Both. I mean it's renewables and
non-renewables also, like
no.
Everything together increases, like the total energy consumption increases?
Yes, because you can see here, basically this is a like it's what is it? It's terawatt hours per year. Like This is energy.
Right.
And you can see that the reduction in fossil is less than the increase in renewables. So basically, this means that there is some substitution, but there is also some increase in energy use.
So in your model, because maybe I don't understand the models, the demand is elastic, like it is not exogenous, like the demand response to. Okay. And so the second question is about the results you get, because now you are lowering the cost of capital and converging. So you are doing two things and you get the result. But I'm not sure the results are driven from convergence or lowering. Which one?
Okay. So basically, what we this I kind of skipped a step. So thank you for reminding this. In the sense that we start from models. Let's say a model has a uniform cost of capital, right? And this would be like at a horizontal line here at 8%. Usually it was around like 8%, right? So it was when we implement this scenario, we kind of forget about that and don't. I mean, then it depends. If the model had a uniform at 10%. Which maybe one had, I don't remember now, it's 2 years ago, but basically this situation makes it better always. It makes it better a lot for low cost of capital countries, increase like super crazy a lot better, because instead of paying 10%, they have like 6% or 4%. And it makes it a little bit better for high cost of capital countries. So these we kind of skipped even in whatever evaluation, because it kind of a little bit straightforward from the origin. It's just a difference between the original assumptions and what we have here. What we say, the results just basically come from the policy, because we compare these two scenarios, and basically our reference is the one in which the reduction through learning happens already, but that's kind of like our reference. Like we don't compare this to the situation in which the cost of capital doesn't go down. I mean, I compared it when I was doing the original data analysis to make sure everything was working, but that's uninteresting because just the situation gets better in a kind of straightforward way. So it's not really so interesting from a policy point of view. So basically all the effects that you're seeing, it's for the convergence part.
Thank you.
We have a bit of a related question online, which is, could you please unpack how you implement the convergence, cost of capital convergence scenario and the IAMs? Let's take GCOM as an example. So bit of a better explanation of the cost of capital.
Yes, basically, I knew I should have written it. It depends. There was quite a lot of freedom in. I mean, the paper is going to be out super soon, and so you can check the methods. There is certainly, especially for GCOM, explained better than I can do now, because I didn't. That's what some co-authors did and not me. But if I remember correctly, basically GCOM has some sort of factor that they use for discounting. And simply this discounting factor was updated with empirical values. But every model implemented it in different way. There was quite some freedom for the modelers to do the most sensible implementation in their own model. So we kind of will get the best result in terms of like coherence within each modeling environment, rather than imposing one way of doing it. So for example, and this also is something that drives the results a little bit, because models that are more centered on energy decisions based on discounting. So maybe image, for example, makes technologies compete due to their levelized cost of electricity, which hinges a lot on discounting. They have a little bit larger effect instead, which that is another model, the one that I worked on, that doesn't have this mechanism, is a little bit less sensitive, maybe because of this. So I didn't answer super well, but I hope it's good enough.
If any clarification is needed, please let us know. I had a related question, maybe, if I may. For the convergence scenario, you say you basically apply or you reduce all costs of capital that are below EU or US levels to their same levels by 2050. What happens after 2050? How do they behave?
Simply after 2050, you can kind of see it here. After 2050, basically just the normal development just through learning effects takes place. So there is not this exogenous rate. So you can see the pathway here. Basically, the development is going to be the same everywhere, something like this. So they just go to the same level and then they just keep on being together. But then there is a little bit every region in each model, and each model has different regions. So it's here we just bundle them up. Has a slightly different dynamics, also depending on the model. But in general, so this is why you see a little bit of the differences between different columns in this graph. But in general, after 2050, just this convergence stop, let's say, because it's a linear convergence. So if you start from like 9%, you have to get to 4% by 2050. So it's kind of like just a straight line from there. And on top of this, learning works.
Yeah.
So they do interact a little bit. But then afterwards, it's just the base rate, kind of, the base cost of capital stays at, like, let's say this 4%. And then there is just the learning going on. Which
still depends on capacities, right, in the countries per technology.
Yes, depends on domestic capacity.
Yeah, so these differences still matter in terms of learning, differences in capacities. Yeah, okay.
Do we have time for? Okay. So one thing and a half, I guess. So do you think the biggest driver of your results is heterogeneity across technologies or heterogeneity across countries? And B, how much do you think the fact that most of these models, maybe apart from image in a sense, work as perfect foresight model underestimates the impacts of, it's perfect foresight, but it's so
Imaclim is myopic, I think.
Myopic,
Imaclim, both Imagine and Imaclim is myopic. Yeah, one thing that I forgot to mention is that these models that we use are very heterogeneous. I can say that the models are, to start from the second, the models are more heterogeneous, like they have more heterogeneity than the heterogeneity that I see in the results. So it's kind of a little bit difficult for me to see, these two models go more or go less because of this or because of that. Also because like some models maybe are more responsive on the price side, some models are more responsive on the quantity side, and some models are neither. So it's a little bit, I couldn't identify something. And the first question, it's driven mostly by country results. Like this is something that we don't do it explicitly in the code, but it basically acts only on the cost of capital by country, on the difference by country. So if I go to this is when the problem of having too many. This is like Ham in Toy Story. At the here. Basically, we kind of look more at the country default spread. Like it's kind of like we are acting on the country default spread thing rather than on the technology premium. We're acting kind of on this implicitly. So this is what drives the result.
Okay, great. I don't see urgent questions online. I don't know how it is in the room, but we're also just done with our time here. So if there are no other questions now, I assume we will close the session. I want to thank you all for joining this webinar, and please join for future webinars, of course. And I want to, of course, thank you, Matteo, for presenting your research, which is really well elaborated. And yeah, the recording will be shared with all participants, and also the paper is about to be published, so please stay aware for the publishment. And yeah, let's keep in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.